Hello, listeners. In this episode, we want to give a trigger warning for content on self harm, suicide, and eating disorders. So please feel free to opt out and prioritize your sense of safety if you need to do so. I feel very strongly about social media and kids.
Good.
You know,
It's good to have a perspective, I think. I think that's
yeah.
what makes it interesting. We're not just reporting the news, right?
Yes,
We
yes, yes.
we we want people to know that we're people and that we have an opinion, that we have a perspective. If it's too dry, then it's not interesting.
Hello there. Welcome to the Good.Enough.Shrink podcast. We are your hosts. I am Jenna Chang, a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing here in Los Angeles, California.
And I'm Dr. Patrick Kelly. I am also a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing in the Los Angeles area.
We are on a mission to demystify child psychiatry and have conversations surrounding difficult topics on youth and adult mental health, but not without a little play along the way. Welcome to the podcast, or welcome back if you've been here before. Today, we are talking about social media, which is a highly anticipated topic of conversation. And I think there's a lot of new definitions and concepts of connectedness that's sort of sprung out of social media. And so we will start with some statistics and just get a feel for how things have been maybe in the last couple of decades with social media. So currently, the world population is about 8 billion people. And more than half of that, so 4.3 billion people in the world have a social media account. This was a study back in 2022. Recently, I looked up a little bit more, and I think it's actually closer to 5 billion now. And I'm sure it's like, every single second of the day, it's rising. What we focus on here is, of course, kids and adolescents. And 95% of youth 13 to 17 years of age use social media. And of them, 30% use it almost constantly. This is by the Office of Surgeon General, US Surgeon General report that was published in 2021. For the younger kids, it's a little bit less. About 40% of kids 8 to 12 use social media, and they spend about 4 to 6 hours a day on screens. And then teenagers, they spend up to 9 hours a day. This is a full-time job.
This was all so surprising to me to learn about. And I know that I may be more in the naive bracket, but I also think that there is a generational difference. And since we're talking about kids, we're talking to parents as well. So there's such a interesting time of change, and there are almost micro generations who experience different waves of social media coming through. When I was in college, MySpace was launched.
Mm. Yeah.
Dr. Chang, did you ever have MySpace? Do you even know what that is?
No, I do. I remember it launched, and I remember that guy, Tom. I think
Yeah.
he was like the face of MySpace, and I do remember that. I think I'm in that sort of age range where I had the benefits of no social media growing up, and then I started to use it a little bit more in high school, but like towards the end of high school. And
Okay.
so it's an interesting experience. But it almost like a bizarre thing. Like, what is this? But yeah.
So that was in 2003. And then shortly after that, Facebook launched in 2004. I actually,
Mm.
in my mind, thought it was much later for some reason. So I think it became popular later. But yeah, it was started
Mm-hmm.
only a year after MySpace. And I
Huh.
never really got into any of that. And then
Mm.
Instagram launched in
Mm-hmm.
2010, Snapchat in 2011, and now TikTok, arguably
Mm-hmm.
sort of the king of social media in 2016. So the implementation and use of social media has really only in quotes, been 13 years. That's not a long period of time for such a tremendous frame shift in how people communicate with each other and how people use these almost natively at this point, that just sort of think of this as their social world, where someone like me, I'm not really even all that familiar with it to begin with. So I think for parents, this might be a nuanced conversation. And depending on even a few years, age different in the age of the parents, they may view their kids and their use of social media very differently.
That is fascinating. It makes me think about, rapid gratification and inability to delay gratification being one of the cons of social media. And to think that everything unfolded in the span of 13 years or so, it tracks. It
Mm-hmm.
tracks with how it makes us feel like so many things are happening, but yet it's not been very long time. And so I think that's where a lot of us in the mental health field, we have trouble because it's really hard to make recommendations or know what exactly the impact on children and adults are from social media, because the research hasn't caught up, and our understanding of it has not caught up to this rapid evolution of social media being suffused in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, we talk about in medical research the idea of bench to bedside, right? How long a study takes from sort of the idea and the very, very initial phases of studying it and medication to when it can actually be applied. And hopefully, our listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory is that that timeline is something like 18 years, is sort of the estimate of about how long that takes, which is longer than social media took to kind of take over the world. And it's not surprising that research, which is so much slower and more diligent and more measured, has not
Mm.
come close to catching up with what's happening right in front of us in our day to day. And during my time as a psychiatrist, the recommendations on sort of what to do about this, how to understand it, have changed and have vacillated wildly. So I think we want to cover our current understanding and the current recommendations and how people are currently
Mhm.
talking about this, understanding that next year we may have a very different podcast, that things may change tremendously. It's such a scary and fascinating time.
Yes. And I think jumping off of that, now suddenly so many people who are not in that sort of research on the mental health side or the psychology side or psychiatry side, they're not involved in that, have never been involved in that. They are more coming from a business side of things or technology side of things. They have such a huge influence on the mental health and well-being of people, especially for us kids and adolescents, that we have to have everybody sort of on board and realize how powerful this is. And we need to have the safety of children on their agenda, which I think is not there yet.
Mhm.
So, a little bit more background data. APA, the American Psychiatric Association, took a poll in 2024, so this year, including over 2,000 adults, that said 31% of parents in 2024 believe that social media has helped their children's mental health. And this is up from 24% in 2022. And then also another important piece of information is that 77% of people ages 18 to 34. So these are, adults, young adults that might be actually new parents, use social media to find mental health information. So, obviously social media is not going away. It's here to stay. And we have found a way to utilize it to our advantage. A lot of positives are coming out from it, and people are starting to realize it.
Yeah, I
So,
agree. And it's a mixed picture, and we want to be very clear that we're not here to say 100% social media is terrible or 100%
Mhm.
social media is fantastic. It's to explore both sides of the issue and to give our opinions. And we have opinions about about social media.
Yeah.
But like everything else, it's in the gray zone, right? That's I think one of my guiding principles in psychiatry and therapy is that rarely is anything black or white. It's almost always in the
Mhm.
grays, in the nuances, and that's what we're here to explore and talk about.
Mhm. And just to give a little plug to attachment theory is the ability to hold the gray,
Yeah.
that we can be good enough and we can be a good person that makes mistakes, and that is okay. So absolutely. So the US Surgeon General today, Dr. Vivek Murthy, I think he's really wonderful because he has published several reports on specifically the mental health focusing on kids. And then he also published a report, a kind of a guide on social media use in youth mental health in 2023. And so he's been quite a bulldozer and pioneer in this area of, youth mental health, which I am all for. And in his report in 2023 on social media and youth mental health, he said adolescents ages 10 to 19 have highly sensitive period of brain development. And so we have talked about neurobiology a little bit here on our podcast as well. But essentially, what he means is going back to that frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex development and synaptic pruning, which is when the connections between neurons are being narrowed down so that you can form and solidify your beliefs, principles, your desires, your value systems. And that synaptic pruning ends right around 25, 26 or so. And so he's kind of talking about the frontal cortex developing, which allows us to inhibit things, kind of control our impulses that a lot of kids and adolescents don't have. And then the synaptic pruning hones in on your ability to stick to your beliefs and stand your ground and understand what you need and what you don't need.
Yeah,
And
it's a
then
real period of maturity and clarification and becoming, if you want to see it in this way, becoming less gullible and more certain and more sort of scientific and ready to evaluate things as opposed to just accepting them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it also relates to the psychosocial development that Eric Erickson had come up with. Right around this age range, between 13 to like 19 or so, you have the psychosocial stage of identity versus confusion. And so this is a time when adolescents, kids are trying to understand who they are, what they want, what they don't want, where they belong. And if you can figure those things out, you have a sense of identity. And then if you don't figure it out, you might be a little bit confused about who you are and you don't really know what you want. And in that confusion, when there is that intense influence from social media, that can be harmful, can be dangerous. And so what he's saying about this 10 to 19 age range is a really, really sensitive time for development. And also of note, from a psychiatry standpoint, it is when depression typically emerges. A lot of times when we talk to adults, we ask them, when do you think you really first started feeling this way? And they'll often point to their teenage years. It's kind of when things are unraveling. And so on top of, normal development, there's this risk of depression, anxiety developing. Frequent social media use also is actually been associated with changes in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. So you can kind of see that there's actual biological changes happening. This was a study back in 2018 and 2023. So we're starting to see some evidence, people are starting to study specifically what social media does to the brain. There's also been some sort of longitudinal studies looking at adolescent social media use being predictive of subsequent decrease in life satisfaction for girls ages 11 to 13, and then boys a little older at 14 to 15. So, and they had started using social media at 11, 13 for girls, 14 to 15 for boys, there was, later on, lots of ways that they feel compared, lots of ways that they may feel superficially connected, but really deeply isolated. So, you can't really deny that there is negative impact. This is probably very nuanced, and I think it's very individualized. But looking at more population data and research studies, this is a hard truth to swallow, I think.
Yeah. I think that's true, that, opinions on both sides. And there's been research that shows some positive aspects of social media. So that's the point of research, is that it's supposed to evaluate in an unbiased way both sides of what you're trying to figure out and what you're trying to look at.
Mm-hmm. And so before going into sort of the pros and cons, which I think like conceptually it's really fascinating, but for parents who might not be as familiar with the different social media companies, it seems like actually the top two platforms most used were YouTube, 34%, and Facebook, 31%. And then Instagram 19%, TikTok 19%. I think this is actually quickly shifting. There is a lot of talks about TikTok, and that's going into the political realm recently. But there's also a little bit of difference between boys and girls. What I was reading was that girls tend to use Instagram a little bit more. Boys might use YouTube a little bit more. There's a little bit more like skill learning on YouTube, how to fix things and whatnot. But again, majority of people, if they're adults, 77% of people 18 to 34 years of age use social media to find mental health information, which is really beneficial for them. So we'll start with the pros. We'll ease in to the benefits of social media. And so it's been shown actually that it can really provide a positive community for especially LGBTQ plus sexual and gender minorities, as well as racial minorities. And so I have so many patients that come and tell me about this, that they feel that they're not alone. They feel that there's language to the ways that they're feeling that is shared, and it's really, really powerful for them. And I think when like everyone around you in person, especially family, is rejecting you as a person, and even in the racial minority populations, 7 out of 10 adolescent girls of color report positive identity affirming content. And so trauma is the theme here with these minority groups. And when there is trauma, there is really need for a sense of belonging, that you're not alone, that you can really go through anything if you're not feeling alone. And so it's been this like vibrant and positive place for connection for these people. Another way that social media can be beneficial is to really be a place to channel people's creativity. I actually had recently someone tell me that their daughter started making money on social media selling her old clothes.
Oh,
And,
wow. That's
yeah,
interesting.
making an Instagram account selling vintage clothing, and she took pictures in this lighting and then set up a payment system. And she's a teenager, and so it's really a place to be extremely creative and get financial reward from it, which teaches kids a lot about real life, adult life.
And I think
Yeah.
the creativity can come out in different ways, and people have different interests and different hobbies. And like we're talking about, they can find a group of people who share that, and they can feel included, they can feel welcomed, they can find places where they're appreciated and accepted. Who knows?
Mhm.
Maybe this person will start an entrepreneurship group and find mentors through that.
Yeah. And of course, it's a good way to connect with people you already know and love. So friends and family sharing pictures of things that have happened to you throughout the day to stay connected. Also, more focusing on the mental health side, it does promote help-seeking behavior. If you're seeing quotes about hang in there or get help or you're not alone, it can be a gateway to mental health care. And oftentimes, social media has gotten better about leaving resources in the comments below or something like that. So it can be a safety tool in times of crisis.
Mhm.
So these are pros, and then I think we can jump into the cons, which might take a little bit longer. So there was a study for kids ages 12 to 15, and this was over 6,000 kids. And they found that for those who spent over 3 hours on social media, it doubled the risk of poor mental health outcomes like depression and anxiety. So the quantity seems to be important, that if you are someone who's checking maybe 30 minutes a day, an hour a day, it's not the same as if someone is scrolling for 3+ hours, up to 9 hours a day. It's a pretty big difference in their experience of social media.
Mhm.
Of course, there is that exposure to harmful content. So I think a few years ago, maybe a little longer, there was this whole copycat suicide thing happening. I recall I think it was called the Blue Whale Challenge, starting with mild self-harm acts and then like working up all the way up to suicide. And it just, I remember hearing this for the first time from a parent. I did not know this existed. And just the horror and the terror hearing something like this existing as a parent. It was visceral. I could feel it. It's just you try to protect your kids from everything, and then they click, 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 make an account on social media, and bam, this is what they're exposed to.
Hmm.
So it does make me really wonder about the lack of informed consent, that really, if you're a minor, you do not have full knowledge of the risk and or benefits of social media and content. And frankly, the social media companies don't want to know their age, right? That's why they don't ask. That's why you can just have an email and just make an account, because as soon as they know the age, then there are repercussions and you have to follow through. But if they don't know, they don't have to act on it, which I think is a huge problem. So it's that concept of, are kids able to make decisions that will protect them from harmful content? I don't think so. I don't think
That's
they're
why
at
kids
that
have
place.
guardians, right?
Yes.
Uh, I
Yes.
mean, most things have an age limit, not only because of the potential implications on the developing brain, but because it's assumed that children aren't fully autonomous yet, right? That they
Mhm.
don't have this decision-making capacity. And I think this is another element of that. I mean, TV shows have ratings, movies have ratings, but social media posts have no ratings. Anything can be out there.
Yeah. And I was thinking about, I grew up with TV. Most of us before social media, the main source of media information was through TV. And I was just thinking about how meticulous TV stations were about ratings, rated PG, rated PG-13, rated G, whatever, and putting on shows that value education. It makes me think about like Mr. Rogers and how much thought he put in to every episode on teaching life lessons, values that kids can take with them. And you just think as a parent, you feel at peace knowing that there is a pretty extensive editing process and
Mhm.
to make sure that the content is appropriate for kids.
Yeah, there are people who that's their only job is just to look at these things and rate them.
Yes. And so, because they don't have that in social media, it's kind of a free for all. It does have a lot of content on what an ideal life may look like. There's this romanticization and glorification of some sort of ideal lifestyle, ideal way to live. With that comes a lot of body image
Mhm.
issues. Disordered eating comes along, and this overall sense that people are meant to live in this happy-go-lucky way all the time, which is not not true at all. In fact, most of the time, I think things are very ordinary. It's just kind of boring, it's routine, it's ordinary. But why would you take a picture or a video and post that on social media? So you're seeing the highs, you're seeing the lows, but you're not really seeing the ordinary, which is 90% of life. So it provides a very skewed version of life to kids. And with a young developing brain that thinks that that's the normal, it really takes away the value of like being bored, being present in the here and now, and not constantly seeking for some stimulation.
Mhm.
Um,
During a lot of the Facebook times
mm,
when the congressional investigations were ongoing, where I think there's an example of one Instagram employee who did this. There was a congressional office that did this, but they sort of set up a false account for
mm,
two girls. I think both were 13, and they started seeing how long it would take given routine undirected scrolling in that age group to start discovering content that either had something to do with self-harm or
mm,
negative body image or eating disorder content. And I'm fairly certain for the congressional office, it was within 1 day. And I believe the Instagram employee said it was something like 10 or 13 posts of just
mm,
following links. So I think, unfortunately, the way the algorithms are geared is that it tries to bring things to the fore that it believes the person would be interested in and that are interesting. And
mm,
interesting things are the more sensational, the more popular, the more emotionally laden. And to that
mm,
age group, you can see how, in the absence of an ethical guide, that suicide, self-harm, eating disorder, all of that would very much come to the fore very quickly. And I do think that it promotes very false ideals of what a body image should be. And frankly, how easy it is, quote unquote, to obtain this optimal body, whatever that may look like. And so there's huge reinforcers of I'm the person who's different. I'm the person for whom this is hard. I can't do this.
Mhm.
If there are easier ways to do this, like just not eating for a period of time or eating and then throwing up, then that's what this is saying to do. Maybe I'll try that. So I think there's a leaning into the more disordered aspects of nutrition, eating, body image, as opposed to, like you said, more of a celebration of the either harder or more diligent or more kind of quote unquote average ways of being.
Mhm. That's really well said.
So
I
yeah,
think
strong
all of that.
feelings.
Yeah. Yes, very much so. And just the fact that primary goal for these companies is how much time are they engaged on this app?
Right.
That's kind of the main goal here. And it just takes away everything else that comes with this. It's quite dangerous.
And there's
And
content celebrating the ideas of having an eating disorder or of
mm,
engaging in self-injury. This may be a little outdated, but maybe 5 years ago, there was a wave
mm,
of pro anorexia and pro bulimia websites, and they were pro ana, pro mia. There was a
mm,
trend where people would wear sort of yellow wristbands or yellow ribbons to sort of demonstrate their endorsement of this, and it was advertised as a lifestyle. This is a lifestyle choice. This is something I'm choosing to do. This is one option in the range of eating habits, and there's nothing wrong with it. Who are you to tell me that what I'm doing is wrong? Which can be
mm.
very dangerous for someone who doesn't have the context to be able to see what the implications of that might be.
Right. And from our perspective, we know that someone with anorexia can feel very, very isolated and alone in their experience. Someone with bulimia can feel erratic, chaotic, unstable in their experience. And a community like that, especially with a wristband or like a pro Anna, some sort of phrase that's catchy, and it can be the one thing that keeps them alive.
Mhm.
Sometimes I think about, we do have to have these things happen to know what to prevent next time. Like it's
Mhm.
hard for me to have imagined that this could be a world today. We're kind of, I think, all learning as we go, but from a mental health standpoint, these people are so extremely vulnerable, and we're maybe subconsciously exploiting these vulnerabilities to create a business.
Mhm.
And that's what I think really gets to me, is that we're not facing what we're actually doing, and that it's really harming kids. In my experience working in the emergency room in a hospital, there are so many kids that come in. It's not the only thing that will lead to their self-harm or suicide attempt, but it is a big thing, and it can be a trigger. Something was posted about them. Somebody made a website to kick them out of school. Somebody made a reel about them changing in the PE changing rooms or something like that. And it just shatters their whole world. Bullying, cyberbullying is huge. There has been multiple celebrities also who have taken their lives from being bullied online. And the hatred is really, really intense. And so I think it also is a product of the times. There is a huge polarization and divisiveness in our society. The motivation and the goal for these social media organizations to prioritize time spent on
Mhm.
their apps. And when that's prioritized above all else, of course, you're going to continue to look and look and look for content that will support what's already formed in your mind, your beliefs. And so there isn't as much open-mindedness, there isn't as much conversation or ability to hold difficult emotions, which is the whole point of attachment theory and this approach that we have here. You don't have the ability to tolerate distress, to hold difficult emotions and agree to disagree. You just want the content to support what you believe. And so there's this polarization that feeds into a sense of being extremely alone, even though on some sort of superficial level, you're supposedly connected through social media.
And I think extreme is a good word because the divisive content continues to get more and more extreme. And people who espouse or hold more extreme views become more popular because it's more
Mm.
engaging and shocking in a way. So it sort of rewards getting further and further away from each other, as opposed to finding ways to have healthy discussions about tough topics and tough issues.
Yeah. And I think there is an addictive component to that. There is this, well, now I have all this evidence and data to support what I believe in. Now I feel connected with people who believe in the same thing. Let's keep adding to the conversation. Suddenly it's 9 hours later. And so there is this extreme rapid dopamine hit that you get one after another, especially on TikTok. I think TikTok, the algorithm, for whatever reason, it is pretty intense how quickly they bring up content that fit exactly what you're looking for. So, with addiction, there's all kinds of things that come with that. Really big thing for brain development is lack of sleep. Suddenly you're not just dealing with the blue light on the screen, you're actually dealing with, I can't let this go, that
Mhm.
I have to wake up and the first thing I do is check social media. That if I take 3 hours away, then I have withdrawal symptoms where I feel restless and I want to check things. And even though you have not heard any notification sounds on your phone, you're checking because you're kind of anticipating that something must have come up in the last couple hours. And so for adolescents, for kids, the addictive component, because they don't have that inhibitory mechanism from the prefrontal cortex just yet, they're still developing, addiction can become a problem and sleep can be a problem.
And we
So,
know how important sleep is to brain development, to developing that ability to self-regulate. And I have seen, this is not evidence-based necessarily, but in some of my own patients, that a lot of times at night, when the house is more quiet, when the parents might be asleep or people are doing their own thing, is when social media seems to really kind of erupt and more people are
mhm.
posting and it's more active and there's more content being put out there. And remember, content comes from all over the world. So while it's midnight here, it might be 3 p.m. somewhere else where someone's following them and they're going out to a party. And so it just seems to never, there never seems to be a peaceful time to shut down and take a break or sort of a natural stop to
Mhm.
it. So somebody can really get into the habit of just checking essentially 24/7 and feeling like anytime they take away from that, they're missing something or something's going to be missed. And it can drive this feeling of anxiety.
Yes. The fear of missing out, the FOMO,
Hmm.
and the anxiety that comes from it. I'm so glad you're bringing that up because the way in which you can't ever get away from what's happening in the world or people judging you or people making comments. It used to be that you go to school, you interact with people, and maybe you have an after school thing, and then you go home and you are in your room and you're kind of all alone if you were lucky enough to have your own room, or maybe you just have a moment to yourself where nothing is happening and you're just staring at the wall. Your favorite TV show hasn't come on yet. It's not 6 o'clock or something. And you just have this moment to be present with yourself, to sit with your thoughts and be a little bit bored and maybe be creative. Like if you're really bored, you might find something to occupy your mind for a little bit. But that's almost non-existent now. Like at any point, you can take out your phone and just look at news updates. I can't remember where I saw this or heard this, but I think the way that these companies have created the interface is that when you pull down on these apps, there's like a little circle that goes around and around, and then it'll pop up new content, even if you do it right after the another time that you've done it. So that is reflective of like slot machines. It'll do like the circle, circle, circle thing. And
That's
so
fascinating. That's really interesting. And
yeah,
then they're
so the
rewarded.
concept,
Yeah.
yeah, and they reward it with new content and it's the anticipation, like what's going to come now. You don't really know when that circle will stop rolling around. And so it, is modeled after something that very well leads to addiction in so many people, like gambling.
We
So,
can talk about the sort of addiction and how that works another time, but it is well known that sort of staggered intermittent reinforcement is the most addictive when you can't predict exactly when or how or whether you're going to win or lose, because that anticipation is part of it. And so that fits very well with the idea of social media. You don't know what's going to come up. You don't know if you're going to like it or not like it, but it's going to be engaging one way or another. Wow, really interesting.
Yeah. There is so much more to this, but I do want to go into the recommendations because that's really what will keep us moving forward. So, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists, which is kind of our premier group nationwide, they didn't have very many specific recommendations for teenagers, but for the younger children, they did say for children ages 2 to 5, 1 hour per day on weekdays of screen time, up to 3 hours per day on the weekends, but to kind of really minimize it, keep it more within the 1 hour mark. For kids 6 and older, they said to encourage healthy habits and limit activities that include screens. So really vague and not specific. They did make a point to say to turn off screens about 30 minutes to an hour before bedtime. So I think this shows that we don't have enough data to make specific recommendations. And because we are very much rooted in research at these organizations, it is really hard to come out and say exactly what parents need to do. And there should be flexibility in this because every family system is different. The American Academy of Pediatrics went a little bit further to say to parents that you want to know the types of interactions your kids are having with screens. And so there is passive interaction where you're just scrolling, and consuming information. There's interactive, so maybe they're messaging through social media with their friends, maybe sharing funny content, and then also there's communication. So like communicating something they believe in, something that they're passionate about. And then there's content creation, which is, they're taking pictures or making it look nice, or maybe they're making little video reels, something like that. But the type of interaction actually tells you a lot about what social media means to the child. And it is a very new area for parenting because now we are forced to form boundaries about something that we never grew up with. And we never had our parents tell us boundaries about social media. So it's an entirely new field. So the American Academy of Pediatrics specifically said to create a family plan. So this is something that the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, also agreed with, is to create a family media plan. And so, you sit down as a family and you talk about what amount of hours is feasible, reasonable, and how do we structure a scheduled no phone time or no screen time. And importantly, this will require the parents to model for their children. If you're telling your kids 1 hour a day, then you are doing 1 hour a day of screen time. And that's really important.
It's so important. The whole kids are sponges, and the whole do what I say, not what I do, it does not work, especially with phones, especially with screen time, something like this. So I have families where just like people have a bedtime, the phones have a bedtime and the phones go to bed in a specific area. But yeah, it's very difficult to say, no, you can't have it while you're on your phone yourself. And just like we're talking about how the science is evolving, the recommendations are evolving. What we're talking about in this podcast right now may be outdated by next year. So the websites aap.org and acap.org do have centers. I know on ACAP there's an area called the Facts for Families that has information on social media and screen time. There's actually a relatively new screen time resource center, screens and media resource center, that has a lot of up-to-date information. So so many people are struggling with this and struggling with these best recommendations. And so parents are not alone in trying to figure it out, just like kids are not alone, right? And there are good resources out there to help form your family plan.
Yes, absolutely. And asking the kids these questions, what do you do on it? What does it mean to you? How is the experience feel like? How does it feel like? This will also allow room for autonomy and agency. And that's something we want to build too. It's not that we just tell them what to do, what not to do, but we want them to ask themselves the question, is social media really, really good for you? Really asking that question, because I do think that if teenagers sit down and think about it, it's pretty blatant sometimes how cyberbullying can be so harmful, and a lot of kids will close their Instagram accounts or close their Facebook accounts because the bullying gets so intense. And so to allow kids for some of that autonomy in these family media plan conversations is important. There are also some cool apps. There's one called Bark, and I know some schools use them, but you can actually set a timer on like TikTok or Instagram. And you can also set up a password so that it's locked, especially for the younger kids. I do think there's a little bit of caution to be had with these apps because it does feel very forceful. It does feel like you're taking away some of that agency. And if you're not having conversation with your kids about why and how and what is happening, then it can feel like they don't matter, that their opinions don't matter. So if you're worried about, I think a lot of kids now, if they need to be picked up from school, they use their smartphones to communicate. There are still, I actually just looked this up. You can still buy flip phones.
Oh, yeah.
And cheap. You can communicate via text and call. So if you really want a form of communication that's not a smartphone, you can buy a flip phone.
And that's not a bad starter, right? As people are getting used to the idea of communicating and texting and calling and having some of that freedom, and maybe someone wants to stay a little later after school, or they want to go to a friend's house but you still want to wait to communicate. You don't have to buy the iPhone 15 as the first phone. You can get a flip phone for a year and then upgrade. There are ways to slowly move into this.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And going back to this idea that this is an unprecedented area for kids to navigate, it's a new definition of the social world. And I was kind of sitting back and thinking about, well, if I was 16 now in this world, what would it feel like? And it really is extremely challenging because you have this severely rewarding stimulus, your smartphone, your social media, and you're having to say no to it. And as a teenager, it's already hard enough to live your day to day, try to get good grades, try to maintain friendships, try to listen to your parents and do the thing that you need to do. And then on top of that, you're supposed to not reach for this thing that's constantly like trying to lure you in to get back on it. That's a lot of effort and energy.
Mhm.
And we're not even talking about the nonstop judgment from your peers on if you do create content, why aren't you posting? I actually recently had someone tell me too that a lot of these apps, they have like your last logged in status. It's a timestamp of your last login. And her friend would be like, you last logged in at this time. Why didn't you respond? There is no
Wow.
break. No
There's no break.
break.
There's no privacy. There's nothing.
Yes.
That's complex.
Yes.
That is a hard world to navigate.
Yes. And so I think equally as complex is how to navigate this as guardians, protectors, as parents.
Mhm.
And so we recognize the colossal task that parents are faced with. And we hope to be alongside with you in this journey and also highlight things from our perspective, from psychiatric mental health perspective, that can foster a balanced understanding and a nuanced understanding of this huge resource called
Mhm.
social media.
Mhm. Absolutely true. And we've been going over the cons, but just to bring it back to balance, we're not saying that, no one should use social media, it should be shut down. There's no applicability for it. But just like, I mean, there are so many analogies. Just like if your kid started hanging out with somebody new, you want to meet them. Or you heard that there's this really interesting new game or thing or group that is bringing more children in, you might be more suspicious and be interested and try to learn more about it. And I think having a curiosity about what your kids are doing, what they're looking at, what they like about it, what is stressful about it for them, and paying attention to that and opening up that discussion with your children so they not only learn what the limits are, but how to evaluate something and make those limits for themselves,
Mhm.
you're never going to go wrong. That's always a good guide.